Over the past decades, there have been a number of slowdowns in the world economy. It is important to understand that not all of them are caused by the arbitrary whims of the market. When the People's Republic of China engages in pernicious restrictive policy on the supply of rare earth that's essential in the element thing to make magnets, to make things that power hospitals, to make anything that you use for medical technology, weapons technology, computers, crucially things that you need to begin developing an economy out from an agrarian labor system. When countries have been complicit in the famine in the Horn of Africa that's been going on for like the past 6 years, not because there isn't food available, but because they decide that it's more important to price gouge and to make other people suffer so that they can derive economic benefit from it. Diplomatic pressure has been absolutely insufficient to this task, Mr. Speaker. We think it's necessary that the WTO stick to the principles of free trade for the benefit of all that it was premised on and implement this model. What do we promote? What do we propose? You will completely lose access to the WTO if you do not remove all policies on the restriction of companies in your country exporting these materials and exporting these goods. I will go on to elucidate why that's legitimate and why it'll be beneficial, but before I do, I will happily take your point, sir. Well, look, that's not exactly an export restriction policy as so much as it is like an import restriction policy and a subsidy program. We also are fans of getting rid of that, right? What we are demonstrating, though, is that there are much more pernicious and severe things. It is not great that people have to pay more for French cheese, but it is much more pernicious that people in Africa die because they can't afford to buy food from exporting countries. It's much worse that people can't make magnets, that they need to make computers or to make medical equipment. Those are worse things, but we would happily support your policy, sir. So why is it legitimate to restrict the flow and the barriers that countries erect themselves? Firstly, we think that is exactly the purpose of the World Trade Organization itself. That it is fundamentally about removing trade restrictions. So policies like TRIPS, in which it places restrictions on when intellectual property is protected and guaranteed in the interest of providing the broadest set of benefits to as many people as possible. But it also opposes policies that are aimed about entrenching political power as distinct from economic power, because we acknowledge that it's found it hard to remove the cap, but the distinction between the cap and an export restriction is you are much better able to use exports as a tool of foreign policy. You are much better able to demand that other people come to you on favorable terms and pay more for your things when you have something that they need. French cheese is nice, I don't need it to make my hospital work. We think that the WTO has an interest and a role to play in not allowing countries to restrict these resources and increase their political power. They're not done in the interest of protectionism. They're not done in the interests of deriving economic benefit. They're done in the interests of making other countries pay. Secondly, the countries that are members of the WTO, and I'm pointing the finger explicitly at China here, have benefited uniquely from the WTO. They have benefited from the reduction of protectionist policies about cheap labor. They have benefited from the policies that remove the barriers to them competing and out-competing rich countries. Given that they have derived that benefit, we think it is entirely legitimate that they go towards returning some of that, that they go towards abiding by the same rules that everybody else should. Thirdly, these countries most often destroy the ability of other countries to even compete on the same kind of footing. And you only need to look at China's acquisition of the Californian rare earth deposits, minimal though they are, and shutting them down. So the United States couldn't compete with them on an even footing in the production of rare earth. The fact that various Russian companies buy up African food lots to redirect the supply of food from African states away from those countries to entrench their foreign power dominance. So that demonstrates that these countries do not abide by the principles of free trade in that they uniquely attempt to crush the abilities of these countries to compete with them. Not just in terms of raising the price of their goods, but in an absolute sense, in choking the industry off in the very country that needs those goods most. Why is it crucial that these resources have free movement? Because they're unique. Food is a unique resource, Mr. Speaker. The fact that it is essential for all trade. It is the fundamental good. If you don't have that, you can't do a lot else. Because even if your people aren't dying on the streets, when they don't have nutrition, it's much harder to educate them. It's much harder to have them be productive. It's much harder to develop your economy in that way. So we think it's essential that you prioritize the flow of food. Secondly, rare earth. The fact that it is extremely finite, and the majority of it in China, and it is crucially important. Most of the products in this room that you are using and having fun with in your spare time, that I'm using to time this debate, are necessary that need rare earth for the operation of their electronics, for the operation of magnets. I know I've said magnets a lot. I'm a physics student. They're the business. Secondly, they are essential for the development of the world economy, because you can't just have economies that go about competing on labor, competing on very basic kinds of production of services. services, right? You need to begin to have economies that can move towards tertiary stages, the provision of services at a high level, like banking, like telecommunications, the kinds of thing that rich countries tend to be very, very good at. It's important that you have functioning electrical systems, functioning infrastructure that can only be made with rare earth supplies. So we think in the interests of all countries around the world, they need to have access to these resources to begin developing their economies more, to begin moving away from the status quo. Thirdly, we think the fact that yeah, sure, I'll take you now. Yes, and your machine gets more expensive when you have to pay more for the goods that make it. Like, that's the problem with this debate. If the magnet that powers the MRI it costs a lot more because China's restricted the supply of the material you need to make it, then even if you could build a hospital, you can't afford the machine because you drive up costs across the board. You drive up costs like across all your equipment, right? That makes it a lot more expensive. It compounds the cost that you have to pay. Thirdly, the fact that the resources are inherently the result of a geographical lottery. The fact that countries do not necessarily have a right to the resources that they have been blessed with by random selection. The universe is a cruel and unfair place, but we think that money and a free market is the least unequal way you can go towards addressing that balance, because people will opt into it, because it allows countries to prioritize more evenly what they would like to have, what they would like to buy, and what they would like to sell. So we think given that this is a lottery, countries don't have an inherent right to demand that they control their resources. We think countries stay within the WTO, Mr. Speaker. The fact that it is better to have free trade for all your goods, or like free trade for the vast majority of your export services, rather than deriving a unique benefit from exporting rare earth or from exporting food. We think the benefits of the WTO massively outweigh it saying that you don't have the ability to extract these resources, to use them as a tool of foreign power, and to use them as a tool of influence. We think this benefits the most uniquely harmed countries in the world under the status quo. Countries that frequently accuse the WTO of failing it. The poor ones, the ones that feel like the United States doesn't do enough to allow their exports into their markets. They now have a much better access to food. They now have a much better access to things that enable them to transition their economy out of the kind of rural agrarian status that it is now. Mr. Speaker, this is an illegitimate policy that's been carried out by China, it's been carried out by Russia, it's carried out by states that are maximizing their influence at the cost of people's lives. We're very happy to propose this policy.
Thank you very much for that speech. Like the first speaker for the opposition.
Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's incredibly lovely to be here, and I think you ought to be congratulated on your fortitude and sturdiness for making it through last night. I'm going to bring you two things today. First of all, I'm going to tell you why actually protectionism can be good and why countries can use these tools to protect internal markets and that kind of thing. Second, I'm going to talk to you about things we really don't think that we should be exporting, like blood diamonds, and things we think should crack down on, should not be allowed to be traded freely. Before that, a few points of rebuttal. Firstly, note, we obviously do not have to defend every single policy restriction on free trade, right? Some of those might clearly just be pernicious. We just have to show you that there are examples in which it is good and that these can be identified. Secondly, right, the big contention is that this really disadvantages certain countries, right? It says if we just allow free global trade, everyone will compete equally, and that will be good for those countries. The problem is, Ghana is never going to be able to produce mass crash crops as well as other Western nations are, that have the advantage of mechanized labor, of mass government subsidy, of pesticides, and all the massive advantages of a huge history of building up that market, right? So it doesn't matter how much you strip away free trade, you still get the hegemons occupying those under the status quo because they've always been able to, right? Then he says, right, the thing is, everyone will stay in the WTO, right? They'll keep on doing this. China's not been in the WTO for that long, right? It managed quite happily outside. If you massively shift the cost-benefit analysis of being in the WTO, given it managed to thrive so well not in there, we think it will just leave, right? We think if he's telling us all these benefits about all the terrible things that China and these economies do, and they say, no, but they will just give that up. We think less people just join the WTO. We think that's good. We think it generally does positive things. No thanks, Al. So let's move on then. Let's move on then to why, for example, protecting your own internal industries at the cost of others can be good. First of all, because we recognize that countries have a right to determine what their own future is, and that does not always have to be done and that does not always have to be decided in the interests of what is best economically for the world. We recognize that certain industries have non-economic value. We point to examples like mining in the north of England, which took on a huge cultural significance to the people who worked in that industry. If you need to clap tariffs on everyone else who is producing that to protect yourself, we think that's something that is entirely legitimate for you to do. Because when you open those up to global competition, often they collapse terribly. We also point to examples like nursery industries, right? Where we think that allowing those to develop under protectionism, I'll take you in a moment, allows them to build up to the point at which they are capable of competing on a global market. Okay.
We're talking about states fucking over other states, not protecting their own.
If you're fucking over other states because they have an export market, right? They're exporting those things. That does increase your ability to work within that industry, right? It just does. So we think, for example, things like those nursery industries. If you clap those export tariffs and you harm the ability of other countries to do those things elsewhere, that does reciprocally increase your own competitiveness on the global stage, right? We think that's especially important, given that the export industries of these countries used to be open more before the 2008 financial collapse to global demand, right? They've stopped that now because that global demand has gone away. No, that has gone away because we don't have the buying power in the first world anymore. We think that's much better then, that they allow themselves to protect their own industries. And we think the WTO recognizes those things and often uses those restrictions to the benefit of those countries. So secondly, let's talk about certain goods that we just don't think should ever be traded, and we think should have export restrictions placed upon them. So there are certain industries, particularly things like blood diamonds, particularly things like rare earth goods that come from countries that have terrible labor standards, where the money goes straight into feeding patronage networks, straight into feeding dictatorships, and keeping them bolstered up, right? So we point you to things like the Kimberley Protocol on diamonds that have been incredibly effective at presenting the flow of those from countries. Not perfect, but much better than the free trade, particularly with regards to the amount of surrounding countries, right, which often would have demand for those things. Those things are massively affected by this. We think that's an incredibly effective way at exerting international pressure. Exerting international pressure on these countries. The point at which which all countries have been more efficient and more willing to get international buy-in. I'll take closing. We don't think the WTO really thrives on international credibility, right? We think the reason people go for the WTO is because they can get benefits from doing so, right? We think the thing it produces is generally good, and people get buy-in on the basis of the benefit it brings to their own economy, right? So the real problem, if we don't crack that, if we remove any ability to to sanction states that do terrible things, or that produce goods that have terrible label standards attached to them, is that status quo just continues, right? So they know that they can make benefits from these things, so they act accordingly. So they do just invite in more companies that are just going to pursue the incredibly profitable but incredibly immoral policies of extraction under the status quo. That is to a certain extent put off. The FDI that works on those industries and on resource extraction is put off by the disincentives the WTO provides to do those things, right? So what have I told you today? First of all, I've told you that the protectionism that they said didn't happen actually does, and why we think that that's an incredibly useful thing for an economy to determine not just what's in their own economic self-interest, but to allow themselves to act when they think their own economic interest is not what's important to them, and when they think there are other things that they want to protect at the cost of that economic interest. Second, I've told you that it massively decreases the ability of the global community to track down and sanction those states that do terrible things. We'd never had to defend all the terrible things that they told you this sometimes results in. We just had to show you a few subsets where it's beneficial under the status quo, and we believe we've done so. And that's why, for St Andrews and Scotland, I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the second speaker for the government.
I don't know how this works. Sorry. Okay. Well, Mr. Speaker, it was insufficient for the opening opposition to completely ignore the bulk of James's material where he told you that because of a lack of access to rare earth materials, lots of transitioning economies don't have the capacity to actually transition from an agrarian economy and don't have the capacity to build the infrastructure that is so crucial to building civil institutions within these societies. That's the bulk of material that Beavis gave you at opening government. The fact that a lot of these resources are distributed based on a geographical lottery. And in light of that lottery, we think it is immoral and inappropriate for the WTO to continue to support a status quo that restricts the supply of any of those materials to states that so desperately need it under the status quo. But what did he tell us in opening opposition? He told us a couple of things. The first thing he told us is that, and this is what I want to deal with in my rebuttal, was that China's going to leave. Couple of responses. One, China spent a long time trying to get into the WTO. So the suggestion that they're just going to up and leave once one policy is implemented that does not necessarily serve their interests is absurd. The second thing they have to remember is that it was incredibly costly for China to actually implement all of the WTO policies that they needed to implement in order to actually join the WTO. So that's why it's not cost effective for them to even do so in the first instance, right? Thirdly, they lose access to a lot of the force that they have under the WTO, right? The reality is China has a lot of clout currently in the WTO, and they lose access to that if you allow them, if they were to leave the WTO, which we don't think they will. But finally, even if they do leave the WTO, even in the worst case scenario that you guys didn't manage to prove that does happen, we still think there are huge benefits on our side of the house, because we think that overall there'll be a reduction on the export restrictions that are implemented, which necessarily means that other economies get access to the materials that they so desperately need, which necessarily means that more people in Africa have access to food, which they don't get under the status quo, which necessarily means that more transitioning economies get access to the materials they need. All right, secondly, what else did he tell us? He said protectionism is good. Right, couple of responses. The first thing he said is, blood diamonds. That's our example of a key export restriction. One, that is not an export restriction, right? Sierra Leone would love to sell their diamonds. The problem under the status quo is that people don't want to buy those diamonds, right? That's an import restriction. That's not an export restriction. So that's not a good example of how your status quo works at all, right? But more than that, what else do they say? They said, well, other countries are just going to be encouraged, are not going to be inclined to support the WTO. We told you at great length in James's speech the types of benefits that rich countries derive from being a part of WTO. So things like TRIPS, things like greater regulation on telecommunications and banking. Those are all things that countries derive from being a part of the WTO. Access to the dispute resolution mechanism, right? There are lots of examples of why the WTO is an excellent institution that countries will continue to sign up to regardless of the implementation of this model. And if all they could point to is an example of blood diamonds, we think that they're struggling in this debate. No thanks. But lastly, what did they say? They said all we need to do in this debate is show that there are some examples of where protectionist measures have been beneficial. You couldn't even show that, guys, so we think that you're already on the back foot here. But more than that, we think that the burden has got to be greater in this debate. This debate is about comparing a status quo in which lots of countries don't have access to the resources they so desperately need versus a couple of marginal benefits derived by some particular countries continuing to erect their export restrictions. We don't think that exists within today's debate. So, what am I going to tell you on this side, on our side of the House at opening government? A couple of points. The first thing I'm going to tell you is why this enhances the legitimacy of the WTO, and the second thing I'm going to talk about is why this actually benefits poor countries. But before I do that, I'll take a point of information. Go.
Given that China currently fixing trade against WTO regulations, that is why you think they will pay for policy.
Okay, we acknowledge that China is not the perfect actor in this debate, right? We acknowledge that they're not, but what we do think is that by and large, there are greater incentives for them to stay in the WTO, notwithstanding the implementation of this policy. We're not trying to stand here and say that China will behave perfectly in all situations, but we think that by and large, there are so many incentives to encourage them to stay within the WTO, notwithstanding the implementation of this particular policy. All right, let's secondly talk about the legitimacy of the WTO, because what we heard from the opening opposition was a convergence of markets. They were unclear as to which markets we were actually talking about, right? The problem under the status quo is that Ghana lacks the capacity to actually be able to sell their particular goods because of things like export restrictions, right? So we think you help those economies in that instance. But secondly, what do we think this does to the WTO? We think it does three things. The first thing it does is that it gives credence to the WTO as an institution that protects the interests of poorer countries in the global economy. Why is that? Because the WTO for a long time has been viewed as an institution that was erected for the protection of richer countries exclusively, right? What does this do? It gives power back to the poorer countries who don't have access to the same resources that that side of the House wanted to assert they do have access to, right? The reality is most of the poor countries we're concerned about, those that exist in Africa, don't have access to the same types of rare earth materials as Beavers told you in his speech. And they also obviously have problems in terms of food supplies. So what does this do under our side of the House? It gives greater legitimacy to the WTO as an institution that is willing to protect the interests of those particular countries. This necessarily means that there is a freer and fairer global playing field for economic reforms to actually happen. So we think you benefit them in that instance. But secondly, what does this do to richer countries, right? Because that side of the House didn't seem to recognise that what we do under our model is actually attack the citizens of these countries, right? You make the citizens in the countries who are implementing restrictionist policies accountable for those mechanisms. But why is that particularly beneficial? It's because in countries like the United States, who do actually need access to rare earth materials as well, and who also are suffering under the status quo, contrary to what the opening opposition wanted to think, right? They too have the political power and the political ability to lobby the WTO for greater reform in terms of countries that are continuing to restrict the supply of these particular goods. So we think you benefit them in that instance. You give them the capacity to actually change some of the restrictionist and protectionist policies that that side of the House was so happy to point to. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the opening of government's case, you should take away three things. The first thing you should take away is that current restrictionist policies are working to the prejudice of some of the most lowest economies in the world. Our side of the House gives power back to those economies and gives them access to resources and materials that they so desperately need. The second thing you need to recognise is that richer countries are too suffering under the status quo, which is why our policy serves their interests as well. Any arguments they had about why this would irritate richer countries was completely fallacious and unsubstantiated. We gave you analysis as to why that would not happen, and even if it did, it was still a better outcome for by and large in the global economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call on the second speaker for the opposition.
Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, when we reflect on the proposition case we've heard so far, I think it's beneficial to actually think about what we're talking about here with regards to these policies, what they actually mean, because they stand up and say that what we're talking about is strictly export policies and only things that apply to export policies. The examples we get here are, for example, food with regards to limits on exports within nations like America, within the Common Agricultural Policy, and examples like monopoly of materials. We just don't think that they accept the fact that export and import is a relative term. Depending on which side of that equation you are, an export or an import may be a very different conception. More importantly, on the idea of food and this concrete benefit they give us, which is the case that when we regard issues like famine in Ghana or within sub-Saharan Africa, the main problem there is that they can't import expensive American corn. No, we think the main problem there is they have systemic economic harms that resulted in a massive famine or a massive situation with regards to not being able to support their infrastructure. At that point, they're probably trying to import from anywhere. They're probably trying to get aid or assistance from neighbors. The main objection and problem with regards to that case, and with regards to the cases they brought us, is not the case that wealthy, overpriced American or European products are export restricted. It's the case that they are expensive, that they are tariffed, that they have issues with regards to things that means that they are never going to be available within those theaters of famine in the first place. That is not a harm that falls on their side of the house because it exists under the status quo. Indeed, much of their argumentation exists under the status quo. When they talk about China acquiring situations, for example, like mineral monopolies in California, that was done through things like private acquisition of implicitly state-linked Chinese business. That is not an import or export restriction. China can still hoover up all the resources it wants out with the control of the government, and all the harms they try and give us about why this is particularly bad exist under both sides. It's a total wash. Because when you look at things like monopolies, they are not a direct result of import or export tariffs. They're a result of aggressive economies with lots of liquid capital consolidating success. That is just a reality of global economics and exists under both instances. Moreover, we just do not think that they can argue that the main problems with regards to China and the monopolies that follow of these resources is that they then refuse to export them to hospitals in the developing world. No, China is very interested in then taking the expensive and valuable imports and exports it has and disseminating them for profit. That is the point. They are not sitting upon a mountain of copper giggling because they enjoy being the big boy on the field. They are doing it because they can then sell to competing industries like Acer, like Kia, like Seagate, like the whole Southeast Asian technological bubble, who are entirely fueled by rare earths and materials accrued by China as a result of these policies. We just do not claim that the harms they give us with regards to food are legitimate, and to claim that the main problems facing the acquisition of MRI machines in sub-Saharan Africa is because neuridium is expensive ignores the fact that no, MRI machines are expensive. At the point at which you don't have hospitals or staff, your main concern is building them, not accruing incredibly expensive material you might see on House or Grey's Anatomy. That's not the primary concern, ladies and gentlemen. And that's then going on to the stuff we gave you with regards to Ben's speech, because we just don't buy that their response was particularly convincing. When we talk about nursery industry, you were looking at things like, for example, the development of auto manufacturing in Southeast Asia. At the point at which you have no ability to limit the imports of subsidized, incredibly underpriced competing vehicles and competing infrastructure from massively interested Western nations who want to ensure you crush any dissent with regards to the economic monopoly, you end up being unable to consolidate your own economic success. You can't have a global industrial presence without first consolidating within your own nation. At the point at which Kia, for example, could never ensure that it could limit the massively protectionist and ultimately aggressive subsidization of vehicles and such like coming in from the West, Kia could never have been built. The South Korean economic boom would never have been ultimately consequent. We just don't think that's particularly relevant. Top's response. No, but they would, because at the point at which you then own these mines and then don't even operate them, it doesn't even fall under the parameters of exports. They're just no longer on the market. They can do all the harms they give you by just simply closing down rare earth mines. But more importantly, we just don't buy, as they tie this into with regards to African analysis, that the main problems with regards to African development are acquisition of rare earths. Many African nations have loads of rare earths. The Congo has billions of rare earths. But the problems there are not derived from the fact they can't access them, or derived from the fact they can't import them, or indeed at all derived from the fact that China is sitting and monopolizing them. They're derived from underlying economic issues that are entirely consequent of issues outside the parameters of this debate. What we are talking about is the meaningful impact on fledgling industry, and more specifically, we think it's entirely legitimate to say the concerns we have regarding the nature of imports and exports with regards to unpleasant states, unpleasant governments, are very relevant in today's debate. At the point at which the exports of foreign diamonds or the exports of conflict resources acquired through any medium of civil war are unlimited, then there is no disincentive under their side to ever not simply vie for these resources. At the point at which the WTO has no barrier of entry upon which economics and which resources are allowed into the global market, then the reason not to simply swing into your neighbor and sit upon their copper mine with a load of Kalashnikovs rapidly diminishes. But more significantly, we say that the principle we want to bring you here is that we just do not buy there should be some common conception of a greater universal good inherent to the mechanisms of the WTO. This is the principal case I want to bring you here, because the point upon which you say that the legitimacy of protectionism is entirely unfair, that there is no mechanism upon which any state has the right to disadvantage any other, then you just ignore the realities and the intuitions we hold with regards to who we have rights and responsibilities to, ladies and gentlemen. We think that there is an explicit partnership between state and citizen, built around a conception of common good and mutual recognition, built around the idea that that state and those institutions will legislate and actively politic on the global stage for your interests and for the interests of your future generations. We think this is an intuitive reality of how we regard our conceptions as national figures. We think this isn't particularly contentious to say, that we then often don't extrapolate our concerns to further instances, to other individuals. We think at the point at which you say you have a global conception of individuals based on some common humanity, then at any point, any morally relevant being relying on planet Earth is equally considered. At the point at which we have, hungry Martians descending, demanding equal consideration because they too are suffering to the extent which, African nations might, you end up at the consequent result of saying that there should be no conception of individual pursuit or meritocratic pursuit. At the point at which you say that a lottery equals illegitimacy, then debating is a lot less fun, because plenty of people here are very talented thanks to the lottery of life, but we still recognize their achievement. We still recognize their meritocratic benefits. We still respect their right to compete and win on their own merits, because we say that the WTO does not exist as an institution to promote some conception of common good, that the goods they have given us aren't achieved through those mechanisms, and that are often awash on either side, and that more significantly, the relationships of state and citizen is as such that they have an explicit duty to pursue policies that benefit their own citizens, their own people, the people who have bought into those conceptions and those conceptions that matter most, ladies and gentlemen. It is on these principles, on the harms we have given you of their mechanism, of the benefits we have given you of the status quo, and of the complete illegitimacy of much of their argumentation with regards to a wash, that we think we are very happy to oppose today's debate. Thank you.
The opening opposition were right in this debate. They don't have to defend all forms of export restriction. And in closing government, we're going to take on an ambitious burden of defending what seems like one of the most sensible and attractive export restrictions. And that is when impoverished countries collect resources they produce and hoard them so that in the instance of ecological disaster or economic crisis, they can feed their people. This sounds like a sensible idea. What we're going to argue at closing government is this is the precise policy that produces those ecological and economic disasters. In doing so, we situate this debate within the world food crisis that we think is the context for this motion. And we suggest as well that this responds to the material at opening opposition, which said that there were kind of inherent features of these states that meant that industries weren't productive. We think deliberate choices these states have made have undermined the development of these industries. And in doing so, we also point out that by pursuing the national interest, this purported relationship that citizens have with their states, means that these states are undermining the interests of their own citizens, that working in collaboration with other states will be better for all. What causes problems in the world food crisis? We think that in 2008, speculation on foreign markets were what drove up the price of food in the third world. But these hoarding programs taken on by nations in the first and the third world are precisely what lead to this form of speculation. When the Canadian Wheat Board or the Vietnamese National Rice Agency sets a fixed quota every year of stuff it's going to hoard, it releases publicly to the farmers that are a part of those agencies and boards and systems the amount that's being hoarded. That gives concrete information to speculators about the likelihood of the future price of those goods, which makes speculation much easier. In a free market, speculators don't have that information. And that's why we see speculation occurring in these kind of rare metal markets and in food markets as opposed to other markets, because export boards provide that asymmetry of information. We say that even if this side doesn't want to defend all forms of export restriction, that organizations like the Vietnamese National Rice Agency give the Canadian Wheat Board cover. That small countries doing this allow big countries to recognize it as well on the basis they also have needs about food security in the future. We think that's incredibly problematic. We'd also say that when even the poorest nations in the world, like Bangladesh hoarding rice, they end up creating these crises. So when in 2006, Bangladesh was starting to worry about the impending world food crisis, they saw a trend of growing prices and a separation between the speculated future price and the current price, they started hoarding rice. That actually produced more hysteria around neighboring countries that also started hoarding rice and other products. That in Africa, when countries competed about how much they could hoard maize, rather than releasing that to the market, they produced the crisis that was ultimately fell upon that state. But we said that fell upon those states and upon the people that live in those states. We say that this is just meaningless and misguided mercantilism that ultimately meant that rather than the price actually being lowered by releasing this, they were worried about a future panic they actually ended up producing. We say this is the second cause of these food crises that we avoid in this debate. What will now be the policy of states if we actually had an open market system and they didn't have this legal instrument in order to protect themselves? We think it would encourage them to diversify the crops they plant. So that in the instance of ecological disaster, where one crop is wiped out, they can survive on another crop. That is a much better state incentive. It will encourage nations in the first and the third world, in the interests of preserving food supplies for the third world, to plant genetically modified crops that are more resistant. Currently, first world consumers are freaked out about that. We think the kind of social justice greens that don't like genetically modified crops will be persuaded more on this system to feed the third world. It encourages all states to build more complex global trade relationships when it comes to food, to rely on more than one supplier. So the instance of economic or ecological crisis, you survive, and we think that's a productive thing. Opening. The problem is that a lot of these states were hoarding far more, that they're hoarding years and years worth of supply for a 2-year crisis, right? So nations in the Horn of Africa, for a drought that went for 2 years, were hoarding maize that was for supplies for up to 4 years. That produced a lot of that crisis. And we think that ultimately that means it's very bad for those citizens in that case. And this is exactly kind of the collective action problem that we want to change or remove. Also, we think that farmers individually in these countries hold back some of their crops in the market so that in bad times they have something to rely on. We think that's a terrible thing because farmers in Africa are not the poorest African citizens. It's the ones that work on those farms that need to be able to buy that maize that are harmed by this policy. So even in times of plenty, when we are hoarding, you're making those products more expensive for your domestic market. And we think that's incredibly damaging for those individuals and means that they can't afford to buy food. Closing. No, because we think that it encourages the first of all, people buying that, encourages them to produce more of that product. We think that's a good thing. But also what we say in this debate is it's much better for them to sell that to the market and gain the capital that's liquid rather than storing maize. Because we think you can't get a loan on maize. We can use that capital to mechanize and develop the industries the opening opposition wanted to talk about. When they're actually receiving money from the first world and circulating around that society, that leads to a much better form of development than just those sort of, well, relatively speaking, richer farmers hoarding that material. That's a bad thing. It would be much better if they actually used that money and invested it back in their community. We think that's a much better form of development. So, moving on to some rebuttal in this debate. The point of information that we received from closing opposition, or our bench received from closing opposition about whether the WTO could convince China to do this. This is a debate about whether the WTO should take a stance. We wouldn't necessarily have to prove they could convince every single country, just that this is a principally good thing that they should stand for in this debate. What our opening wanted to talk about was in fact not really export restrictions, but lots of import restrictions. The way they dealt with that strategic error was to have this kind of economic term relativism, where they're like, when you think about it, an import is just an export, which is actually not true. We think that there's a difference between not letting someone buy something and not selling it to those individuals. But the examples they gave weren't even, we think, necessarily good ones, because the nascent industry argument maybe works for Kia building mechanized cars, but not for farming, for which we think you can start up with very little capital and successfully sell to people. We don't think that analogy worked in this debate. That if we're talking about things like diamond certification processes, we could have those certifications occur in a different way that doesn't come in the form of an import restriction. Currently, you have to sell to the board for the Kimberley process to work. We would just ask the Kimberley process to set up as an agency that rates those diamonds rather than buying them. We think in this debate that sometimes when states are acting in their interests and in the interests of their citizens, they're undermining the interests of those citizens, particularly when it becomes the most important goods like food. And it's for those reasons that we're proud to propose.
Is that on? Yeah. Government bench is correct to say that world trade today is unfair. But it's not unfair because developing countries can't afford rare earth metals. It's unfair because the power structures that exist in world trade mean that the United States, the European Union, and China can simply ignore the restrictions that the World Trade Organization places on them, whereas the World Trade Organization can easily force its restrictions on the developing world. This denies the developing world the ability to sell things like food to the West, and therefore creates an overall incredibly unfair power structure. From closing opposition, we advocate the World Trade Organization taking a specific advocacy stance in favor of developing nations and existing as an arbiter for them to collectively exploit the fact that they do have control over rare earth metals and particular resources in a way that allows them to benefit in an unfair trade world. So that means we're going to bring to you 2 points of extension. Firstly, about power and world trade at the moment, and secondly, about exactly how it is that that export restrictions can benefit countries. First, some rebuttal though. So we've heard an extension from closing government that says that that restrictions on food are the part of this debate. Firstly, we don't think that that is the only context of this debate at all. We think that there is an enormous minerals boom occurring in Africa at the moment. That means that countries like Zambia and Angola and throughout that continent have vast amounts of copper and tungsten that give them significant control over those resources. That's why China is investing there. They're making a lot of money. So opening government falls out of this debate because they're completely wrong that they can't afford those minerals. They have those minerals. We also say that that means we don't have to support hoarding by developing countries. That means they can't export to other developing countries. But finally, we say that there are a whole series of other reasons why the food crisis is occurring. Speculation and hoarding is also occurring in the West. Biofuels development in the West is driving up prices of food. The price of oil is driving up the prices of food. But also simply, some of these countries like Somalia have had enormous droughts that mean that the crops have actually failed. It means that they can't actually grow food. We say that this means that that extension isn't particularly strong. Okay, so then, the first point of extension that we have, power that exists in the World Trade Organization. Because what you heard from opening government was that if the World Trade Organization takes this stance, it means that they'll lose those benefits. They generally don't care about those benefits, right? So China, so recently they tried to initiate a series of trade rounds in Doha to try and drop agricultural subsidies. They failed because the Western world did not want to drop their agricultural subsidies. A series of Chinese policies, including their export restrictions, are condemned by the World Trade Organization, as is their currency fixing. China then, instead of acting within the World Trade Organization, instead chooses to act entirely outside it, by doing things like initiating, going into Africa and bilateral agreements and trying to exploit resources there. We say that the World Trade Organization can act as an arbiter for those African countries to instead work with each other instead of purely with China. We say that that occurs in the same way with the United States, which has initiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement to try and exploit free trade with Southeast Asian countries and New Zealand. We say that that means that they typically ignore the World Trade Organization when it tries to impose restrictions on them. We say that that's true. What else do they also tried to tell you, sorry, I'll just continue. So we say that the World Trade Organization should actively advocate for these nations and allow their ability to exploit copper, tungsten, and rare earth metals to a certain ability. Why do we think that the World Trade Organization should do this? We don't think that free trade is the be-all and end-all of the World Trade Organization. We think that it's fair enough for them to advocate for people that are unfairly biased against currently in world trade. But even if free trade was their aim, we say that the immediate and long-term development of these countries will actually be better for them. We also say, finally, that the problem that they tried to say was that these countries can't afford tungsten. Given that they have tungsten already, we say, well, the problem that they have there, though, is that tungsten typically is bought at the Western price, right? So if you drop export restrictions, even in China, it only gets purchased by the United States. And because West has high demand, they're rare earth metals, right? They're valuable. Western countries, developed countries, still won't be able to afford them because price competition will be too high. I'll take opening now. Yes. Yeah. Copper, well, tungsten obviously is an example, but they have significant amounts of copper, which we say is going to be significantly more of a rare earth metal. But also, they just didn't address the analysis that I just stated, which is that developing countries can't afford these prices because they're Western prices that they don't have control over. They finally tried to tell you that the problem was a geographical lottery. We say that there are a series of other lotteries that have significantly harmed these countries, like colonialism, like the various resources that existed in other places. We say that that means a problem. And if they want to benefit from the geographical lottery that currently exists, we think that's fine. So, what are the economic benefits then that do arise for these countries? Because opening government tried to say there are economic benefits, didn't provide the analysis. We're going to do that right now. So what do we think these countries should specifically do when they have control over particular rare earth resources? We say that they should restrict the amount of those resources that can be exported, thereby lifting the price at export, but lowering the price within their countries because that develops a surplus amount of resources within it. We say that when we're talking about food, we think that this is good because it will lower the price within that country and allow people to afford it. It will also allow, if you have wheat, greater development of other options like developing bread and things like that. We don't think that you're going to see huge harms as a consequence of this when they do have those sorts of resources. But secondly, when we're talking about countries, which actually do exist across large amounts of Africa, right? There are mines that are cropping up in South Africa, Angola, Zambia, like Botswana, Sierra Leone, but there's also future development potential in places like the Congo. We say that this is actually an extensive part of this debate. We say that it similarly also probably applies in extensive parts of South America and Mexico where mines and resources haven't been exploited in the past because these countries have been poor and the opportunity hasn't existed. What happens when you do restrict that export price? We say that means the price of that good is cheaper within your country. That means that there is an incentive to invest within that country and develop the manufacturing that that rare earth metal needs within that country. So Zambia doesn't want to export tungsten so much as it wants to export light bulbs. We say that that means you're going to get investment within that country with a cheaper price in manufacturing light bulbs. That develops a new manufacturing method, secondary forms of development and secondary industry, which is absolutely crucial to the long-term development of that country. We say that when you develop those manufacturing industries, you bring in wealth, you bring in alternative forms of development. We say that that's also better for providing jobs actually within that country, because mining typically requires high-skilled imported workers or terrible mining jobs. We say that manufacturing is better for the low-skilled workers within that country. We say that that means that they're going to benefit more from this resource. We say that currently these countries are unfairly benefited by the fact that there are import restrictions on the goods that they have in other countries. We think it's fine for them to respond using the World Trade Organization as an arbiter. We oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call on the final speaker.
Mr. Speaker, there was a very specific reason why Swain and I chose in this debate to talk to you about why hoarding and reserving food is bad for the future of developing countries. It's because the opening opposition in this debate attempted to tell you that these countries should have the right to determine their own future. We told you that the way they're going about achieving that future is currently misguided. But then you heard from the closing opposition that, well, the WTO has a disproportionate power over these poor countries, but that the WTO taking the stance that we wanted them to wouldn't have the effect of telling them that they could no longer hoard this food. We thought that that was an insufficient response to our extension, and in fact, the idea that the WTO does have this power over these developing countries just proved that the benefits of our extension were in fact going to come into being. The first thing I'm going to do is talk about why hoarding food or reserving food is a misguided way of going about trying to protect your own country's food. Then I'm going to talk about power politics in the WTO, or the extension that you heard from Otago, before finally looking at some of the residual issues from opening opposition. Firstly, Why is this a misguided way to go about attempting to actualize the best future for developing countries? We gave you a number of reasons why we thought that hoarding and reserving food quantities within your country was a bad thing. But I also just want to clarify that we think that food and the reserving of food is one of the most important issues in this debate, because we think it is one of the most important issues to the civilians of these countries and to these countries themselves, particularly when we have seen from May 2007 to May 2008 the types of extreme and severe price fluctuations in that market that literally lead to a food crisis that means that these people cannot eat. Why do we think that that food crisis is caused by the hoarding of food? That was for a number of reasons. Firstly, when countries, whether they are developing or developed, have the capacity to hoard food and then flood the market with the reserves, we think that that leads to increased speculation. Why does that speculation create a food crisis? Let's look at this empirically. From May 2007 to May 2008, the volumes of globally traded grain and in futures and options rose by 45% in options and 17% in futures. What we also saw was almost the trebling of the prices in terms of barrels of wheat during that same time period. It was that speculation in those markets that drove up the price of food for the people in this debate who are in the worst position to be able to afford those price increases. What you do when you allow export restrictions is you allow countries the ability to flood the market at certain times, but more importantly, speculators to gamble on that flooding of the market, leading to that speculation which drives up the price. So we would say that when the opening opposition attempts to say that hoarding or reserving things leads to a self-determination, we think that's fundamentally untrue, because it makes the market less certain and it makes the market problematically uncertain for people who cannot afford those price fluctuations. But we also told you that the hoarding of food is actually a very self-fulfilling prophecy. That it's not just one country in this debate that we were talking about hoarding food, and maybe the closing opposition's rebuttal to our extension would hold if it was only one country. But the problem is that as soon as one country starts hoarding, then all of their neighbours start hoarding, and everyone around the world starts hoarding. What is the problem with that? It is possibly true that in the very short term, hoarding food will drive down your prices domestically. But when everyone is hoarding food, Mr. Speaker, if that food was put onto the international market, it would lead to cheap prices on the international market rather than just in selectively and segmented domestic markets. So we think that the idea that this creates hysteria and a self-fulfilling prophecy whereby people hoard food leads to the precise type of food crisis that we didn't want to see happen in this debate. But perhaps importantly as well, if that food crisis doesn't eventuate, it means that when you do go to sell the reserves that you have hoarded, you are selling them at a lower price because you are anticipating that you will only get a benefit on the basis that that resource will be scarce. We think that exacerbates the scarcity, but even if it didn't do that, and we were totally wrong in our analysis of the 2007 to 2008 food crisis, we would say that those countries would still be in a worse position because when they did seek to sell those reserves, they will be selling it at a lower price. But then these guys, no thanks, said in their rebuttal that, well, you are making these countries more vulnerable to these types of food crises because you're saying that they aren't able to hoard or reserve for that. Why do we think that's untrue? We think that we encourage people to diversify their crops and to invest in things, I'll take you in a moment, like GM food. Because yes, to some extent, we make them vulnerable to the whims of the environment, but we think that that means that we encourage them to have more structural productivity, which is a good thing in the long term to ensuring that those markets actually survive. Yes, opening. Well, because we think that they have been doing that. This is the exact same POI that you asked Swain. They are over-hoarding to an extent that it leads to these food crises happening. They are hoarding much more food for the reasons of the hysteria that I already just spoke about, and that is exacerbating the problems in creating the food crisis. I don't know why you agree with that analysis. That is a problem for your side of the bench. Then let's look at why we encourage mechanization. Because we told you it's problematic for individual farmers to hold their assets in agricultural crops. We would much prefer them to get liquid capital so that they could reinvest that back into their business. What did Otago say on this? They said that, well, if it is cheaper to access food, then you will have more money in order to actually pay for that mechanization. But if on the international market people are willing to pay a higher price, you will get more money for the food that you are selling on the international market. Otago was very, very unclear as to whether or not they thought that this was actually going to be cheaper or more expensive in the long run. Why was their analysis of power politics in this debate fundamentally untrue? They said that, well, you already have access to minerals. As our opening pointed out in a POI, that is some minerals, not all minerals, which is why that analysis does not stand up in this debate, and also did not respond to any of our analysis, our extensive analysis about food markets. We also think that when you are paying Western prices, as they asserted, that you are able to sell those resources at a higher price, get that money back and invest it back into your own country. A lot of the analysis of the opening was dealt with by Swain. We think that basically they were mainly talking about import restrictions, that we can still have accreditation processes for things like blood diamonds. That doesn't in any way contradict the stance that we have taken in this debate. What did we tell you? We told you that food is the most important market that we need to stabilise, that allowing speculation and driving up the price by people acting in their self-interest, which is actually shooting themselves in the foot, is the worst way to go about doing this. That's why we were proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call on the final speaker of the opposition.
The government side in today's debate clearly lives in a very different world from you or I. They live in a world where the food crisis wasn't caused by developing nations hoarding oil and putting up the prices of the export and the transport of that food. They live in a world where developing countries don't have to make these struggling and difficult decisions because of their underdeveloped economies, which are being exploited by the West and by developed nations. There are broadly two questions in today's debate. Firstly, what is the role of the World Trade Organization, and what can the World Trade Organization actually do? And secondly, how does this policy bring about development within these countries and benefits to those countries? I'll answer both of those, obviously, in my speech. But before doing that, I'd just like to touch on this extension that we heard from closing, right? So the extension here runs that it was really bad when these countries made sort of a collection of poor decisions to hoard food. One of the primary reasons these countries made these poor decisions to hoard food was that developed nations, which are not affected by your policy, because they don't have to listen to the World Trade Organization, were hoarding oil and putting up prices artificially. Another reason these countries were affected by the food crisis was because agricultural subsidies in the United States make it almost impossible for their farmers to compete with other people. We'd say on this side of the house, these problems were caused by countries which you do not affect and countries which continue to exploit the World Trade Organization to bully and push these poorer nations into making decisions which are bad for them in the long run. But finally, we'd say another reason these countries had a food crisis is there were some droughts, right? They ran out of food and they have an underdeveloped economy, which we are fixing on this side of the house, which made them far more vulnerable for natural climate fluctuations and droughts and other problems within that country. So we just don't think it's that much of a large part of today's debate. Right, let's move on to what is a large part of today's debate. What is it that we see the World Trade Organization doing? We're very proud on this side of the house to stand up and say that the World Trade Organization shouldn't just exist to ride roughshod over developing countries and expand and produce free trade agreements that will reward those who have developed from past lotteries. We think that it's a harm when these countries with mineral wealth, like the mineral boom in Africa, the countries with tungsten, are unable to add value to those goods and bring about a greater benefit to those goods. all that free trade does is it allows the injustices that exist, the fact that manufacturing exists in other countries, not in these countries, because of past historical injustices, to become more pronounced and more extreme, because it becomes impossible for these smaller nations to stand up and actually make policy which allows them to develop industries within their own countries. But more broadly, we'd say that free trade actually becomes easier the more developed these countries are, right? Because the more powerful they are economically, the better able they are to actually bargain and to actually get some like real free trade with the Western nations, with their currently obscene subsidies on their goods and then their current like manipulation of the global markets that we see from the West. So we think more broadly, free trade, if it is the primary goal of the World Trade Organization, which we don't think it is actually easier under our system. But then the next question is, what can the World Trade Organization actually do? And it's problematic for opening government that they face their entire case on, oh, China hoards metals that causes some harm from China hoarding metals. Yet China is the country in the World Trade Organization that ignores the fact it's not allowed to fix its currency. And I'll tell you why that is in just a second. Opening. Right. The reason it's true is because the ability of these countries like Zambia to make like a progress on those metals and make like an advantage from those metals is hampered by the fact that China is coming in and like taking those metals themselves, right? It's hampered by the fact that China is able to act as a bad faith actor and take advantage and exploit the fact that these countries actually possess some of those rare earth metals. It's the bad faith actor that you don't deal with. And why is this? The reason for this is that China is an incredibly powerful economic country, right? It's not that China needs the World Trade Organization or that China relies on the World Trade Organization to get bilateral agreements. China can get those agreements. The World Trade Organization wants China to be part of the World Trade Organization. That's why there was a sort of push to let China into the World Trade Organization. We say the same analysis holds true for other Western nations like the United States. That means they're in the position of power in this relationship and they're able to flout and ignore the kind of policies that they want to put upon them. Right. That was the first point. So their policy has no effect on those they've identified as the primary cause of harm. What's the next point? The next point is this benefits developing industries within these countries, right? Because is the problem in these developing nations that they can't afford tungsten just because it's being hoarded? Or is the problem that their companies can't afford tungsten at the prices that Western companies are able to pay for it, right? The problem here is that countries like the United States are always going to be able to outbid on prices of food or prices of the rare earth metals. They're always going to be able to pay more than the poor people in these nations who are able, in these nations who are going to be able to buy it. That's really harmful for those people in and of themselves. But to the extent that we heard from opening government that, but the problem is, they can't import these resources, we'd actually say these countries very often possess the resources in the country that those people need to survive, right? It's not that these countries don't produce food or don't produce wheat or don't produce the things people need to live. The problem is that the people on the ground in those countries are not able to buy the milk and food and wheat that these countries possess because they're not able to pay the extortionate Western price that we are lucky enough to be able to pay. But more importantly, in all these industries, like in wheat, like tungsten, like in copper, which is actually a metal in high demand and is by effect rare, that's a ridiculous point of information. If they're cheaper within these poor countries, that means that manufacturing is easier within those poor countries. This is something that went largely unresponded to by the case. And this is so important because the reason manufacturing doesn't occur in these countries at the moment is not because, Zambia is a really bad place to build light bulbs. It's because there are biases in the status quo that mean the places to build light bulbs are overseas and elsewhere in the United States and in China, right? If you reduce the price of tungsten within these countries by restricting the exports, so keeping the thing as a surplus inside that country, that reduction in price makes it profitable to set up industries that use these. Those value-added industries are so important because it is by going through value-added industries these countries are able to actually get meaningful development, and then they're less likely to make the poor decisions about food hoarding that the government wanted to hinge their case on. Opening government fell out of today's debate when they were unable to prove this would bring a benefit to their primary problem. And closing government just simply failed to grapple with what the problem is in these developing nations is, which is a lack of development. We're proud to stand up for development and justice.
All right, one quick announcement. Please